Hello and welcome to Coffee with Maxwell. For this episode, we're going to talk about the best way to store coffee. We're not going to talk about freezing because that's quite an in-depth, complex process that you might do if you're so inclined, where you have to break the coffee up and vac seal it into individual little doses and freeze it over time. That really is a great way to store coffee. I'm interested in weighing up the more practical, everyday solutions to storing coffee. So you buy a bag of coffee. It could be a cafe, you could be buying it for home, and you have to open that bag. Now that coffee was probably freshly roasted, put into a bag, most of the time not with any inert gas, but it's sealed and there's not too much oxygen in there really. Maybe you open it at day 6 or day 7 from roast, and now what you've done is you've breached that environment. Let's say it was 250 grams of coffee in a bag with a small amount of headspace. And then you need to either decant that coffee into another vessel, or you need to reseal that bag or that pouch. And then over the duration that you use that coffee, which is probably going to be 2 to 3 weeks, something like that, where you're going to come back to that environment, back to that vessel, and you're going to disrupt that environment again and again and again, because you're going to take some coffee out of it to make a drink from. And by the time you get to week 3, time has passed, and that environment has been breached many times, and it's probably quite different. And so how can we get that coffee to taste as similar the day we pop open the bag to the last dose that we consume before the bag's over, before it's finished? So I guess the question is, what is the problem we're really addressing here? What is it that makes coffee stale or taste less fresh? Well, there's probably 3 things that are happening. The first one, which is the biggest one, is oxygen. Oxygen's a problem. It's going to react with the coffee and create rancid flavours, unpleasant flavours. It's going to introduce negative flavours to the coffee. The second is losing volatile aromatics. And the third is the loss of CO2. There's a really interesting anti-CO2 sentiment in coffee. Although I understand why, is that with excessive amounts of CO2 straight out of the roaster, it can be unpleasant. I do think there's a point, like a lot of things in life and in coffee and in food and in drink, where there is an optimal amount, and trying to get rid of it all, well, I think it actually gives a bit of effervescence to the coffee, a bit of sparkle. You just can't have too much. CO2, interestingly, is also a good preserving gas, which is interesting. It also gets used like nitrogen. But obviously we associate a lot of negativity with the CO2 created in coffee. Although not if you like crema on your espresso, because if all the CO2 is gone, you won't have a crema, which is what you see when you brew espresso with stale coffee. Anyway, those 3 things we're trying to avoid. And how do we get those 3 things? Well, they nearly always come with headspace, right? Let's take the worst case scenario, which is this bag of coffee here. This has just been open. So oxygen can come in, wherever it likes, react with the coffee, CO2 is all left, and aromatics are happy to leave as well. So this is probably, the worst scenario. So for this episode, I'd really like to focus on the idea of headspace, because I think when you address this as the root cause of the problems with most storage, well, the solutions are possibly surprising. They're possibly very, very simple, and I think they might actually be sitting in plain sight. And so recently, we've been playing around with packaging. We want to move all of our freshly roasted coffee away from being packed in a hand-sealed bag and onto an automated line with nitrogen flushing. This will allow us to roast in bigger batches, but also flush with nitrogen and increase the shelf life, and somebody should be able to open the bag of coffee and it tastes better quicker, so they don't need to rest it as long, but also you can keep it for a long, long time, until of course you breach that environment. And I just wanted to do a little practical experiment to play around with this idea of headspace. I took a naturally processed coffee, roasted for filter, from Burundi, called Burambi. And I took a freshly roasted bag, I let it rest for 4 or 5 days, and then I opened it, and then I decanted it into 4 different containers. Well, 2 of them are the same, but I've used them differently. And so all the coffee that I started with is from the same bag. And my inspiration for trying this really came from 2 places. It was, how are we going to recommend to store our coffee when we move away from using the zip. It's really hard to put a zip into a bag in your own line, and it creates all sorts of problems. Also, it makes it harder to recycle, etc., etc. And I started thinking about the problem of headspace, and it took me back to 2016, when myself and Chris had just written Water for Coffee, and we were invited by Nico from Telescope in Paris, a beautiful little cafe, intimate, quality-driven, amazing, to go and give a talk on Water for Coffee. And we went there, and I was offered a cold coffee, a cold black coffee. Now, I don't really like any cold black coffee, really. Cold brew in particular, I don't like, which I am in pretty good company on that one. But because I don't like it, I'm always interested to see how people do it and to taste it. And he gave me this cup of black coffee over ice, and it was pretty good. Like it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, which is quite a lot for cold brew. I said, Nico, how did you make this? It tastes pretty good. And he said, oh, I just brewed it hot and I cooled it down in the fridge. And I was like, well, I've tried to do that. Whenever I do it, the coffee tastes grassy, astringent. So how exactly have you done it? And I explained to him my problems, my challenges trying to do the same thing. And he said, oh, well, what I realised is that I was putting it in a container and putting it into the fridge, and I was leaving loads of headspace. There was loads of oxygen. So by the time you chilled it down and took it out of the fridge, it tasted astringent, grassy, dry. It effectively had been heavily oxidised. And so his solution was unbelievably simple. He took one of those simple glass bottles with the little flip top seal containers, lids even, and he said he realised when headspace was the problem that the solution was just to fill the bottle all the way to the top. So there was no room for oxygen, so it couldn't be oxidised. I mean, it's so incredibly simple. And so I was thinking about this recently, and I also went to a cafe we work with in Wembley, and they had some of the Yemeni coffee that we'd sold at Christmas. And bear in mind, it only went about a month ago, so this is several months after roasted and shipping. And they'd opened the bag and they drank a lot, and there's a little bit left, and they said, would I like some? So, yeah, I'd love to try it, see how it's tasting. It tasted brilliant, like really, really exceptional. And then I saw how they were storing it. Recently, you've seen a lot more of these coffee storage canisters. This one is the Fellow one. It's very nicely made, and it's pretty really neat and nice to use. And what you'll notice is there is a lot of headspace in here. And this is a fixed environment. You can't collapse this, you can't make it smaller. So what you have to do is suck the air out. And that's what it does. It basically creates a little vacuum by sucking the air out. It's got a neat little mechanism where you go back and forward until the top little button goes green. Now, which is an indicator that we've removed most of the oxygen, really through creating a vacuum. How low the oxygen goes, I don't actually know without testing it, and it's quite hard actually. How do you get in there and test how much oxygen is actually left? Anyway, you do that each time, and then obviously each time you use a dose of coffee, the headspace gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the challenge of removing all of the oxygen gets harder, harder and harder. Although I like this device and I understand what it's trying to achieve, is it really going about the problem in the wrong way? Alternatively, you've got a typical Ziploc bag. Now this one I've left open on purpose to be fully oxidised. Oxygen can come and go at will, aromatics can leave, CO2 can leave. This is exactly the same bag, but every time I've used it, I've resealed it. So oxygen, more and more oxygen cannot come in and circulate. But really, in all three of these cases, I've got a structure. In this case, it's a cylindrical one. In this case, it's a box-bottom triangular one. And there's headspace. There's headspace here, there's headspace here, and there's headspace here. And so really, we just don't want any headspace. And so then you start asking yourself, well, really we want something like a toothpaste tube, where every time you squeeze out the toothpaste, the tube gets smaller, and there is no headspace. The tube just matches the volume of the ingredient that remains in there. And then you think, well, okay, if only we could do that in coffee. But we'd need a bag. Wait a minute. We put coffee into bags. Maybe the best possible way to store coffee is like this. I mean, granted, that's not a very pretty red clip, but you could have a much prettier clip. Now, by not having a zip on this, it forces you to wrap it, to close it. And by not having a solid structure to it, it's easier to wrap. And it means that every time I take the coffee out, I wrap the bag up. And so every time I reduce the headspace and I leave almost no room for oxygen. So let's taste the difference. Okay, now I've prepared these as a simple cupping. I've only done one bowl each. I have actually done this test a bit more thoroughly and blind before, but I just wanted to take you through this from a demonstration point of view. So first of all is the coffee that's been in the fellow. It tastes nice, it's juicy, like I expect this coffee to be, but it's a bit short. It doesn't pop, it's not as big. This coffee here is really not very good. so at least that bit of the test worked, which is leaving a bag open is a bad idea. So there you go, you've all learned something you didn't know before this video. That's quite similar to the fellow. Juicy. But still a bit short. There's not much in it between these two, to be honest. Very, very similar. And last of all, the rolled up bag. I mean, it is the best cup. Its acidity is the strongest, the brightest, sweet. It's got more longevity, more complexity, a longer finish. Basically showing the least staleness, the least exposure to air, which kind of makes sense, right? This revolutionary idea of a rolled up bag wins. And for me, I've done a few tests like this, this comes out on top. But for it to come out on top, it needs to be a bag, a material, which is an oxygen barrier. So if you put this in a brown paper bag and did the same thing and rolled it and clipped the top, that wouldn't work. Right? You do need to be able to not only get rid of the oxygen in the headspace, but the container, the vessel itself, has to keep oxygen out, right? But give it a go for yourself. Buy a bag of coffee, break it up into different bags, seal and use those bags differently, and see which one comes out on top. It's not the prettiest, but the Humble coffee bag rolled up is actually very practical. It's like it was built for the job. Thank you very much for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe. And remember, you can support the creation of this content on my Patreon.